Call me immediately, Margaret. Don't discuss this with anyone, especially your daughter. That was the first line of the email, and I must have read it a dozen times before I even realized my coffee had gone cold in my hand. Robert Hayes had been my family's attorney for nearly 20 years. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't use capital letters or vague warnings. When my husband died, he handled everything quietly, efficiently, with the kind of calm that makes you believe nothing truly terrible can happen as long as someone like him is in the room. So if he was telling me not to talk to Emily, something was very wrong. My first thought wasn't betrayal. It was illness. An accident. Some paperwork issue tied to Daniel's estate that I had misunderstood. Emily had been helping me with forms for months, patiently explaining things I could no longer make sense of on my own. She said it was easier if she handled the online accounts, the bank portals, the insurance correspondence. I had been grateful, proud, even, that my daughter was so capable, so devoted. I set the mug down and noticed my hand was trembling, just slightly, like a loose thread in fabric you only see when the light hits it right. Outside my kitchen window, the morning looked painfully ordinary. A delivery truck rolled past. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped. The kind of sounds that usually made me feel anchored. Today they felt distant, like I was already standing outside my own life watching it continue without me. I checked the time. 8:12 a.m. too early to call someone unless it couldn't wait. Robert would know that. He was meticulous about boundaries. Another line from the email surfaced in my mind. Please call from a private line if possible. That made no sense. Who was I supposed to be hiding from? I live alone. Unless. No. The thought formed, and I pushed it away before it could take shape. Emily had been here just 2 nights ago. She brought groceries, reorganized my medicine cabinet, kissed my cheek before leaving. You have to let me take care of you now, Mom, she had said, smiling in that soft, reassuring way that made her look like she had never been a difficult child, never slammed doors, never shouted that she wished she had a different mother during those terrible teenage years. People grow up. They soften. That's what I had told myself. I opened my phone to call Robert, then stopped. My reflection in the black screen startled me. I looked older than I remembered from yesterday. Not frail exactly, just exposed, as if some protective layer had been peeled away overnight. I suddenly wondered how long this message had been sitting in my inbox before I noticed it. What if it had come late last night? What if something had already happened while I slept, unaware, trusting, safe in a house that might not even be mine in the way I believed it was? The idea was absurd, yet it lodged in my chest like a small piece of ice. I stood up, walked to the front door, and checked the locks. All secured. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser Emily had insisted on buying me. It'll help you relax, she'd said. I remember thinking at the time that it smelled too strong, but I kept it because she seemed so pleased. Now the scent made the house feel staged, like a model home no one actually lived in. My phone buzzed once in my hand, another email notification, and I nearly dropped it. But it wasn't Robert. Just a promotional message from a store I didn't remember signing up for. Still, my heart kept racing as if something had chased it out of hiding. I realized then that whatever Robert was about to tell me, a part of me already knew it would change how I saw my daughter forever. Not because of evidence, not because of facts, because of the way he had written that single sentence, especially your daughter. I pressed the call button before I could lose my nerve, lifting the phone to my ear while staring at the quiet room around me, trying to memorize it exactly as it was: sunlight on the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint lavender in the air, because some instinct I couldn't explain told me that by the time Robert Hayes answered, nothing in this house would feel the same again. Call me immediately, Margaret. Don't discuss this with anyone, especially your daughter. That was the first line of the email, and I must have read it a dozen times before I even realized my coffee had gone cold in my hand. Robert Hayes had been my family's attorney for nearly 20 years. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't use capital letters or vague warnings. When my husband died, he handled everything quietly, efficiently, with the kind of calm that makes you believe nothing truly terrible can happen as long as someone like him is in the room. So if he was telling me not to talk to Emily, something was very wrong. My first thought wasn't betrayal. It was illness. An accident. Some paperwork issue tied to Daniel's estate that I had misunderstood. Emily had been helping me with forms for months, patiently explaining things I could no longer make sense of on my own. She said it was easier if she handled the online accounts, the bank portals, the insurance correspondence. I had been grateful, proud, even, that my daughter was so capable, so devoted. I set the mug down and noticed my hand was trembling, just slightly, like a loose thread in fabric you only see when the light hits it right. Outside my kitchen window, the morning looked painfully ordinary. A delivery truck rolled past. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped. The kind of sounds that usually made me feel anchored. Today they felt distant, like I was already standing outside my own life watching it continue without me. I checked the time. 8:12 a.m. Too early to call someone unless it couldn't wait. Robert would know that. He was meticulous about boundaries. Another line from the email surfaced in my mind. Please call from a private line if possible. That made no sense. Who was I supposed to be hiding from? I live alone. Unless. No. The thought formed, and I pushed it away before it could take shape. Emily had been here just 2 nights ago. She brought groceries, reorganized my medicine cabinet, kissed my cheek before leaving. You have to let me take care of you now, Mom, she had said, smiling in that soft, reassuring way that made her look like she had never been a difficult child, never slammed doors, never shouted that she wished she had a different mother during those terrible teenage years. People grow up. They soften. That's what I had told myself. I opened my phone to call Robert, then stopped. My reflection in the black screen startled me. I looked older than I remembered from yesterday. Not frail exactly, just exposed, as if some protective layer had been peeled away overnight. I suddenly wondered how long this message had been sitting in my inbox before I noticed it. What if it had come late last night? What if something had already happened while I slept, unaware, trusting, safe in a house that might not even be mine in the way I believed it was? The idea was absurd, yet it lodged in my chest like a small piece of ice. I stood up, walked to the front door, and checked the locks. All secured. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser Emily had insisted on buying me. It'll help you relax, she'd said. I remember thinking at the time that it smelled too strong, but I kept it because she seemed so pleased. Now the scent made the house feel staged, like a model home no one actually lived in. My phone buzzed once in my hand. Another email notification, and I nearly dropped it. But it wasn't Robert. Just a promotional message from a store I didn't remember signing up for. Still, my heart kept racing as if something had chased it out of hiding. I realized then that whatever Robert was about to tell me, a part of me already knew it would change how I saw my daughter forever. Not because of evidence. Not because of facts. Because of the way he had written that single sentence, especially your daughter. I pressed the call button before I could lose my nerve, lifting the phone to my ear while staring at the quiet room around me, trying to memorize it exactly as it was, sunlight on the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint lavender in the air, because some instinct I couldn't explain told me that by the time Robert Hayes answered, nothing in this house would feel the same again. Robert did not say hello when he picked up, which frightened me more than anything else because he had always been unfailingly polite, even when delivering bad news. And instead there was a brief silence followed by my name spoken in a tone so careful it sounded like he was placing something fragile on a table between us. Margaret, are you alone right now? And I said yes. Though suddenly I wished I had not, because being alone had never felt like a liability. Before this moment, and he exhaled slowly as if confirming something to himself before continuing. I need you to listen carefully, and I need you not to contact Emily until we speak in person. And my throat tightened at the way he said her name, not warmly, not neutrally, but with a distance that suggested she was no longer simply my daughter in his mind, but part of a legal problem, something documented, categorized, potentially dangerous in a quiet administrative way, and I asked him what was going on, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound like the competent woman I had always been rather than someone who suddenly felt like the floor beneath her had shifted a few inches to the left. And he paused again before saying, over the past several months, there have been a series of transactions authorized under your name. And for a moment I felt relief because that sounded like exactly the sort of thing Emily had been helping me manage. Bills, transfers, adjustments to. Accounts after Daniel passed. All the tedious details that pile up when a life partner disappears and leaves you holding a stack of responsibilities that used to be shared. So I told him that yes. My daughter had access to help me with online banking because the passwords were confusing and the verification codes never seemed to arrive when I needed them. and he responded very gently. Margaret, these transactions were not routine, and something in my chest went hollow at the word not, like stepping onto a stair you thought was there and finding empty air instead. And he continued, explaining that large sums had been moved from my savings into new accounts that did not previously exist in my portfolio, accounts opened using documentation that bore my signature. And I remember staring at the framed photograph of Emily on the counter, taken at her college graduation, her arm around me, both of us smiling into the sun as if the future were something predictable and kind. And I heard myself say that there must be some mistake because Emily would never do anything without telling me. She had promised after Daniel died that we would be completely transparent with each other. No secrets, no surprises, just the two of us navigating the world together, and Robert's voice softened even further, which somehow made it worse. That is why I asked you not to speak with her yet, he said, because we do not know what she believes you already know. And the implication of that sentence moved through me slowly, like cold water spreading through fabric, and I asked him how much money he was talking about, expecting perhaps a few $1,000s, something explainable, something fixable. But instead he gave a number so large that for a second I could not attach meaning to it. It was just a sequence of digits, floating in the air between us, too big to belong to my quiet life of grocery lists and prescription refills and morning walks around the block, and my knees felt weak enough that I had to sit down at the kitchen table, the wood cool beneath my palm, grounding me in the only reality that still felt solid. And Robert said my name again, more urgently now, asking if I was all right. And I told him yes, even though the word came out thin and unfamiliar, because if I admitted I was not all right, then this would become real in a way I was not ready to face. And after a moment he added one more sentence, the one that would replay in my mind long after the call ended. Margaret, based on the documentation, it appears these actions were deliberate. And I closed my eyes, not to cry, not even to think, but simply to stop seeing the room that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. A woman who had trusted too easily, signed too quickly, believed too completely that love was a kind of protection that could not be forged or transferred or quietly withdrawn without her noticing until it was far too late. I remained standing in the doorway of the small office long after the call should have ended, my hand still resting on the cool metal of the filing cabinet as if it were the only thing anchoring me to the house. And Robert's voice came through the phone again, softer now, but unmistakably firm, asking me to return to the kitchen table, to sit down somewhere comfortable because we still needed to discuss immediate steps. And the phrase immediate steps sounded clinical, almost ordinary, yet I understood it meant my life had shifted from something familiar into something procedural, something that required containment, documentation, strategy, and I walked back slowly, noticing details I had overlooked for years, the slight dip in the hallway carpet where Daniel used to pause to tie his shoes, the faint scuff on the wall from a piece of furniture we had moved a decade ago, proof that time leaves marks even when people try to smooth them over. And when I sat down again, Robert asked if Emily had keys to the house, and I answered automatically that of course she did. She was my daughter. She needed to be able to check on me, bring groceries, let herself in if I did not hear the doorbell. And as soon as I said it, I felt a new layer of vulnerability settle over me, because keys meant access. Access meant presence even when unseen. And Robert suggested I consider changing the locks as soon as possible, not because he believed she would do anything harmful, but because control over physical space often paralleled control over financial matters. And I stared at the front door, imagining it opening quietly while I slept, not with malice, but with purpose, someone moving through rooms with the confidence of ownership. And I realized with a jolt that I no longer knew whether Emily saw this house as my home, or as something she was already preparing to inherit, or worse, something she considered partially hers already. And Robert continued outlining the process for freezing accounts, contacting institutions, verifying identity through channels that Emily could not intercept, each instruction practical, reasonable, yet every word chipped away at the simple narrative I had believed for so long. That families protect each other, that trust accumulates rather than erodes, that love is not something you need to audit like a bank statement. And I found myself asking the question I had been avoiding, whether Emily had withdrawn money for herself personally, or if the funds were tied entirely to that distant property purchase, because there was a strange Difference in my mind between selfishness and calculation, between a daughter taking something in desperation and a daughter constructing an alternative future funded by her mother's savings. And Robert hesitated before answering, which told me the truth before he even spoke. And then he said that several transfers appeared to cover personal expenses as well, items inconsistent with my normal spending patterns. Luxury retailers, travel, services, deposits for furnishings, the kind of purchases associated with establishing a new household rather than maintaining an existing one. And I felt a sharp image form unbidden. Emily walking through a bright, unfamiliar apartment choosing curtains, dishes, artwork, building a life piece by piece while telling me she was too busy with work to visit more often. And I remembered the last time she declined dinner, saying she had a late meeting, how I had packed leftovers for her anyway, labeling the container with a small note so she would remember to heat it properly, a gesture that now felt almost unbearably naive, like sending supplies to someone who was already planning to leave you behind. And my chest tightened, but no tears came. Only a heavy pressure that made it difficult to draw a full breath, as if grief had been replaced by something denser, less expressive, a kind of quiet compression. And Robert asked if there was anyone else I trusted who could stay with me for a few days, a friend, a neighbor, a relative not connected to Emily. And I realized how small my world had become since Daniel died, how thoroughly my daughter had filled the role of primary support, leaving few others close enough to step in now. And I answered that I would be fine alone, though the word fine felt strangely hollow, not a statement of strength but a lack of alternatives. And after we ended the call, I sat there listening to the refrigerator hum, the clock ticking steadily on the wall, ordinary sounds that suddenly seemed too calm for a morning that had quietly dismantled the foundation of everything I thought I understood about loyalty, about family, about the simple assumption that the person you raised would never become someone you needed to protect yourself from. After the call ended, I did not move for a long time. Not because I was stunned in the dramatic way people describe in movies, but because my body seemed to be waiting for instructions that never arrived, as if some internal system had shut down and was rebooting slowly without telling me what functions would come back online. And eventually, I noticed the clock on the wall had advanced nearly 40 minutes. The thin second hand circling with the same quiet determination it always had, indifferent to whether the day contained ordinary errands or the unraveling of an entire life. And I realized I had not yet done the simplest thing Robert suggested. I had not checked my bank account myself, because until that moment part of me had been able to treat the conversation as theoretical, a story about documents and signatures rather than something measurable, visible, undeniable. And my laptop sat on the counter exactly where Emily had placed it 2 nights earlier after helping me order a replacement filter for the air conditioner. The screen still faintly smudged with fingerprints that were probably not mine, and when I opened it the familiar login page appeared, asking for a password I did not immediately remember because it had been months since I entered it without assistance, and I tried the one I thought was correct, but the system rejected it politely, suggesting I use the recovery option, which sent a verification code to an email address I did not recognize, and that small detail landed with more force than any accusation could have, because it proved that access to my own finances now required permission from somewhere else, somewhere I could not reach. And I sat there staring at the message until my vision blurred slightly, not from tears but from the strain of focusing on something that refused to resolve into something manageable, and I closed the laptop slowly, as though it might react unpredictably if handled too quickly. And in that moment, I understood why Robert had not wanted me to confront Emily yet, because I did not even know the full extent of what had been changed, what systems had been rerouted, what pieces of my identity had been quietly relocated to places I could not follow. And the house felt different again, not unsafe exactly but unfamiliar, like staying overnight in a relative's home where you know where the bathroom is but not which floorboards creak or how the heating system sounds when it cycles on. And I walked to the living room window and looked out at the street, half expecting to see Emily's car pull up, to see her step out with that brisk, purposeful stride she had inherited from her father, carrying reusable grocery bags and calling out that she was here. Everything normal, everything intact. But the street remained empty except for a neighbor watering his lawn in slow sweeping arcs, sunlight, catching the droplets and turning them briefly into something beautiful before they disappeared into the grass. and I wondered if he had any idea how fragile the appearance of stability really was, how quickly a life that looked solid from the outside could be hollowed out from within. And my phone vibrated on the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. And for one irrational second, I hoped it would be Robert calling back to say there had been a mistake, that the transactions were routine. After all, that Emily had simply forgotten to mention something. But when I picked it up, my heart stumbled because the screen displayed her name, Emily, accompanied by the cheerful photo she had set as her contact image, taken last summer at the lake, her hair windblown, eyes bright, looking every bit the devoted daughter she had always presented herself to be. And I stared at the phone as it rang, each pulse of sound filling the room with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe, because this was the moment where two versions of reality collided, the one in which she was calling to check if I needed anything from the store, and the one in which she might already suspect that I knew something, that the carefully constructed silence around her actions had been disturbed, and my thumb hovered above the screen without touching it, suspended between habit and caution, between the instinct to answer immediately, as I always had, and the new awareness that every interaction from this point forward might carry consequences I did not yet understand. And the ringing stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt louder than the sound had been, followed by a message notification that appeared a second later, simple, casual, almost affectionate. Just checking on you, Mom. Call me when you can. And I set the phone down without replying, not out of anger or accusation, but because I suddenly realized I no longer knew how to speak to her without revealing what I had learned, without pretending nothing had changed. And for the first time since the morning began, I felt a clear, steady thought settle into place, quiet but undeniable, that whatever happened next would not be about preserving the comfort of our relationship, but about protecting what remained of my independence, even if doing so meant facing the painful possibility that the person on the other end of that message was no longer someone I could trust simply because she had once called me mother. The message stayed on the screen long after the notification tone faded, those simple words carrying a weight that felt entirely disproportionate to their softness. Just checking on you, Mom. As if concern itself had become something suspicious, something that might conceal motives I was only beginning to understand. And I found myself replaying every recent interaction with Emily, every visit, every offer of help, not searching for dramatic evidence, but for subtle shifts, the moments when she had steered conversations away from certain topics, the time she had insisted something was already handled before I even realized it needed attention. And I remembered how often she had discouraged me from answering unknown calls, saying it was probably spam, how she had suggested going paperless to reduce clutter, how she had gradually positioned herself as the filter through which information reached me. All of it framed as efficiency, as care, as modernization, and I realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that none of those changes had felt alarming because they had been introduced gently, one at a time, like lowering the lights in a room so gradually you do not notice how dark it has become until you try to read. And my eyes drifted to the small calendar pinned to the refrigerator door, its squares filled with Emily's tidy handwriting marking my appointments, deliveries, reminders to take medication. And suddenly it looked less like a helpful tool and more like a map drawn by someone else, charting my movements, my needs, my vulnerabilities, and I wondered how much of my daily life had become visible to her in ways that made planning easier, more precise, more detached. And the thought did not make me angry so much as profoundly tired, because anger requires energy, and what I felt instead was a deep weariness, the kind that comes from realizing you must now examine everything you once accepted without question. And my phone vibrated again, not a call this time, but another message from Emily, a short follow-up. Did you get my text? And the urgency of it made my stomach tighten, not because she sounded worried, but because she sounded attentive, as if she were monitoring my responsiveness, measuring the gap between contact and reply. And I set the phone face down on the table as though hiding from it might delay whatever confrontation was forming on the horizon. Though no actual confrontation had been scheduled, no accusation spoken, just the quiet knowledge that silence itself can provoke questions. And I stood up and walked to the sink, turning on the faucet even though I had nothing to wash, simply to create noise, a barrier between me and the oppressive quiet of the house. And as the water ran over my hands, I noticed they were colder than usual, the skin pale, almost translucent in the morning light. Hands that had packed lunches, buttoned coats, wiped tears, signed birthday cards. Hands that had once held Emily's small fingers while crossing streets, trusting that one day she would walk beside me as an equal, not ahead of me into a future she would not share, and the memory arrived so vividly it made my chest ache, not sharply but with a dull persistence, because love does not disappear just because trust fractures. It lingers, complicating everything, making even protective decisions feel like betrayals of your own history. And when I turned off the water, the sudden silence returned heavier than before, broken only by the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. Normal life continuing with complete indifference to the quiet crisis unfolding inside my walls. And I realized then that if Emily came to the house unannounced, I would not know how to behave, whether to act natural, whether to pretend ignorance, whether my face would reveal too much before I spoke a single word. And that uncertainty frightened me more than the financial loss, because money can be calculated, documented, potentially recovered, but the erosion of certainty about how to relate to your own child is something far less tangible, far more destabilizing. And I returned to the table, picked up the phone again, and opened the message thread without typing anything, scrolling back through months of cheerful exchanges, reminders, photos of meals she had cooked, articles she thought I would enjoy, small digital tokens of closeness that now felt like artifacts from a version of our relationship that might never have existed in the way I believed. And as I reached the earliest visible messages, I saw something I had overlooked before. A gradual shift from her asking questions to her making statements. From "Do you need anything?" to "I will take care of it." From "When are you free?" to "I will stop by on Tuesday." Subtle changes that seemed insignificant individually, but together formed a pattern of quiet takeover. And I understood with a sinking certainty that whatever Robert and I did next would not simply address unauthorized transactions, but would force a confrontation with a truth I had been unconsciously avoiding, that the daughter I raised with the expectation of mutual care in old age might have been preparing for a very different arrangement, one in which my role was not partner or parent but obstacle, something to be managed efficiently so her own plans could proceed without interference. And the realization settled over me not like a storm, but like a long shadow stretching across the floor, slow, inevitable, impossible to ignore once you see where it falls. I did not realize how long I had been sitting there until the sunlight shifted across the table and illuminated the edge of a small stack of envelopes near the fruit bowl. Ordinary white mail that I had assumed was nothing important because Emily usually sorted through it before I did. And something about the way the light caught the top envelope made me reach for it almost absent-mindedly. The way you pick up an object just to confirm it exists, and when I turned it over I saw my name printed in formal black letters rather than the handwritten notes or promotional logos I was used to, which made my pulse quicken slightly as I slid a finger under the flap and opened it carefully, as though whatever was inside might be fragile. And the document that emerged was not fragile at all, but stiff, official, the kind of paper that carries authority simply by existing. And it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at because the terminology was dense, filled with references to property, ownership percentages, escrow timelines, language that belonged to a world I had never navigated alone. And then I saw the address, not my address, not any place I recognized personally, but the same city Robert had mentioned earlier, the same state far enough away that visiting would require a plane ticket rather than a casual drive, and a cold awareness settled over me as I scanned the page more closely, noticing a section labeled Beneficial Party, followed by my full legal name, Margaret Collins, typed cleanly as if it had been entered into a system by someone who had never met me, and below that another name, Emily Collins, listed as authorized representative. The two of us connected in a formal structure that suggested partnership, while concealing the imbalance of information between us, and I tried to recall any conversation in which she had mentioned purchasing property on my behalf, any moment when she had asked if I would consider investing, diversifying, planning for relocation, but nothing surfaced except vague comments about the housing market being strong and opportunities disappearing quickly, remarks I had treated as casual observations rather than declarations of intent, and my hands began to tremble again. Not violently, but enough that the paper made a faint rustling sound in the quiet kitchen, a sound that seemed to underscore the fact that this was no longer abstract, no longer confined to bank statements or legal theories, but something tangible, documented, filed somewhere in an office building hundreds of miles away, proof that decisions had been made in my name without my participation, and I wondered how many other letters like this had arrived before, how many had been intercepted, sorted, redirected, explained away before they reached me, because Emily always collected the mail when she visited, saying it saved me a trip to the box at the end of the driveway, and I had never questioned that arrangement because it felt considerate, efficient, loving even. But now every convenience seemed to reveal a second purpose, like furniture designed to conceal storage compartments you only notice once someone shows you where to press, and I lowered myself back into the chair, the document resting on the table in front of me like an object that might move if left unattended, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine Emily not as a daughter acting impulsively or selfishly, but as someone executing a plan step by step, gathering permissions, establishing control, securing assets, constructing a future that included me only as a legal entity rather than a person with opinions or boundaries, and the thought did not produce anger so much as a deep, hollow sadness, because it suggested that somewhere along the way she had stopped seeing me as a partner in our shared history and started seeing me as a resource, something finite to be managed before it was gone, and I realized with a dull ache that perhaps she believed she was being practical, even responsible, ensuring stability for herself in a world she perceived as uncertain, rationalizing each decision as necessary, justified, inevitable. And that possibility hurt in a different way than outright malice would have, because it meant the betrayal might not even feel like betrayal from her perspective, just preparation, efficiency, forward thinking, qualities I had encouraged in her all her life without imagining they could be directed back at me like this. And my phone buzzed again on the table, another message lighting up the screen, but this time I did not look at it immediately, my attention fixed on the document, on the neat printed lines that transformed my existence into a set of entries in someone else's project, and I understood then that whatever confrontation awaited would not be a single explosive moment, but a gradual unveiling of choices she had already committed to, paths she had already begun walking, leaving me not at the center of her plans, but somewhere behind her, trying to catch up to a version of reality she had constructed while I was busy believing we were still moving forward together. The document lay in front of me like a question that had already been answered somewhere else, in rooms I had never entered, by conversations I had never been part of, and as I stared at the official seal in the corner, I felt something inside me shift from confusion to a quiet, almost clinical clarity, the kind that comes when denial finally exhausts itself and leaves only facts behind. Because no matter how carefully I tried to reinterpret what I was seeing, there was no innocent explanation. For property purchased in my name hundreds of miles away, managed by my daughter without my knowledge, structured in a way that gave her authority while leaving me responsible, and the imbalance of that arrangement felt deliberate rather than accidental, as if every clause had been designed to look cooperative while functioning as control, and I suddenly understood why Robert had sounded so cautious on the phone, why he had not explained everything at once, because this was not simply about money or paperwork, but about the dismantling of trust piece by piece. And my gaze drifted toward the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall, images of birthdays, graduations, vacations, moments preserved as proof of a life shared openly, honestly, lovingly, and I wondered at what point that openness had become one-sided. When Emily had started keeping entire chapters of her decisions hidden while continuing to participate in those smiling snapshots, and the dissonance between the woman in the photographs and the one implied by the documents made my chest tighten in a way that felt more like grief than fear. Grief for something that might have ended long before I realized it was ending. And my phone buzzed again. This time not a message but a call, her name filling the screen in bright letters that felt almost intrusive against the quiet gravity of the moment. And for a few seconds I simply watched it ring, aware that answering would collapse the distance between suspicion and confirmation, forcing us both into roles we could no longer pretend not to understand. And when the ringing stopped it left behind a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though the house itself were waiting to see what I would do next, and I exhaled slowly, noticing for the first time that my breathing had been shallow, constrained, as if my body had been bracing for impact without my permission, and I reached for the landline instead of the cell phone, an old habit from a time when important conversations happened on a device anchored to a place rather than carried in a pocket, and dialing Robert's number felt steadier, more intentional, like stepping onto solid ground after walking across something that might not support your weight. And when he answered, I did not bother with pleasantries, simply said that I had found additional documents, that Emily was listed as my authorized representative on a property purchase, that I had never consented to such an arrangement, and there was a pause on the other end long enough to confirm that this was not routine, not something easily explained away, and he spoke carefully, choosing each word as though precision mattered more than comfort, telling me that this information strengthened the case for formal intervention, that we could begin steps to revoke any unauthorized authority, to notify institutions that my consent had been misrepresented, to reclaim control over my own affairs. And as he spoke, I felt something unexpected rising inside me. Not panic, not rage, but a quiet determination that surprised me with its steadiness. Because for weeks I had felt like a passive observer watching pieces of my life rearrange themselves without permission. But now there was a path forward, concrete actions that would not depend on Emily's explanations or cooperation. And the realization that I could act independently again felt almost like rediscovering a muscle that had gone unused for too long. And when the call ended, I remained seated for a moment, looking around the kitchen as though seeing it with new eyes. The familiar cabinets, the worn spot on the floor where I always stood while cooking, the clock ticking above the doorway, all of it still mine, still part of a life I had built long before any hidden plans began to encroach on it. And I understood then that whatever confrontation awaited, whatever conversations would unfold, the most important shift had already occurred inside me. A refusal to remain in the dark about decisions made in my name. A refusal to accept convenience in place of consent. And as the afternoon light softened across the room, I gathered the documents into a neat stack, not because organizing paper would solve anything, but because the act itself felt symbolic, reclaiming order, asserting that these were no longer secrets drifting through my life unseen, but evidence I would use to protect what remained of my autonomy. And for the first time since the lawyer's message had appeared that morning, I felt not speechless but prepared, aware that the next time Emily called, the conversation would not revolve around reassurances or vague explanations, but around boundaries, truth, and the undeniable fact that I was still capable of making decisions about my own future, no matter how quietly those decisions might need to be made.